Okay, Dad, today is Saturday, July 13th. We didn't have a podcast yesterday because you were recovering from heart surgery and you're still maybe a little slow, anesthesia still wearing off of you.
Yeah, minor heart surgery. It wasn't anything like, um, yeah, they didn't
Yeah,
break open my chest or anything like that.
but
Yeah,
yeah,
but
cardiac ablation. Still, it's a heart surgery is heart surgery. But I was thinking, you're recovering from anesthesia. I still think, despite that, you will be, much more eloquent than our president. Um, we can kind
yeah,
of
well,
start there.
yeah, I had quite a few Biden moments during the first few hours after waking up from surgery. I think I know what it's like to be Joe Biden, or I knew back then. Hard to remember where I was, what I said 30 seconds ago.
Yeah, it's just I just can't get over the fact that he's our president and that we're running with him. You know
Well,
that
yeah, maybe we'll see.
Yeah, after this big boy press conference is what they were calling it, at the NATO summit. You know, what I've been, a lot of people are saying, a lot of pundits are saying that he did just good enough to still stay in the race and still that the Democrats can't kick him aside, which is mind blowing. I'm like, really? Did we see the same press conference? Because clearly he's
Yeah,
not all there.
right.
He's just clearly
Yeah,
old. It's
right.
just
Well, that was the overwhelming impression for me, that he was just very old, very feeble, and that he managed to string together sentences that more or less made sense, but just barely. I mean, he was dealing with sometimes fairly complex issues, and um, he didn't demonstrate any real understanding. You didn't see any forceful intellect. You would want somebody, when you're talking about economic policy, or certainly, foreign policy, which is, of course, mostly what he talked about there. When your adversaries are Russia and China. I don't think they need to be adversaries, but that's what they've chosen. You want to see a forceful leader, right? A vigorous leader, and a leader who is obviously intellectually in command, has a grasp of the facts, and understands all the arguments, thinks ahead. And you didn't get any of that sense. It was just like he barely managed to give something what you might call a reply that, more or less, he more or less answered the questions, but he did so very feebly and with just very minimal coherence.
right. No, it was a very uncomfortable press conference. I didn't enjoy it at all.
Yeah.
I thought like, oh, this might be interesting. Watch him, watch his gaffes, and it might be kind of comic. But I didn't find it really
No,
funny.
no,
I
it's
just
actually
found
it's a
it
very sad spectacle.
right. Yeah, it was very painful. And I think that's how the whole world felt watching it. First of all, most people don't really pay attention to these NATO summits, but everybody tuned into this NATO summit. It's not so much to hear what, the NATO stuff, is more to see Joe Biden. Like this is the guy that's in charge of the supposed free world, and waging these complex conflicts in Israel and Palestine and Ukraine and Russia. And it was just like I was kind of almost just rooting for him, almost like, just come on, just hold it together. But he couldn't. He just couldn't do it, and it just I can't believe that this is what we have. That
Right.
this is our president. This is the leader, and I don't know. What do you think is just the impact of this this NATO summit and his speech just on NATO and these conflicts and just his presidency overall?
Yeah. Well, clearly, I think there's panic behind the scenes. Some people are trying to maintain a brave front, and, like you say, claim that this was a success for him. But I think it was clear to everyone who was there, which were all the presidents and prime ministers of NATO countries, that this guy is not up to the task, and they must be very, very worried. Um, and I think they're probably going to have to come to terms with Trump presidency. I think maybe that's what a lot of them walked away thinking, is say, okay, we're going to have a President Trump, in starting January of next year. Um, yeah, this after basically, they said that it was expressed by Biden, and and I think at least one of the questioners, probably more than one, that that Trump could possibly end NATO. That that clearly, that they've made it clear at this conference and other places that they simply don't want Trump. I think that's remarkable in itself and shows how things have changed. In past years, NATO was never supposed to get involved in U.S. Domestic politics. I mean, it was unthinkable that it would. It was just taken for granted that, these were domestic affairs of the U.S. and that NATO would continue. Now, I guess the reason that they bring it up is this idea that somehow Trump would end NATO, and he's made comments like that in the past. But he also has a record. He was president for 4 years from 2016 to 2020, and he in fact strengthened NATO during that time. And I think that ended NATO. He made these requests that the NATO countries contribute more to the collective defense, and they did. In the end, NATO was a bigger organization and a more well-funded organization at the end of his term. There are a lot of people that, let's say, who are on our side that are very excited about a Trump presidency because we see the potential that, maybe he could end NATO, or maybe he could at least restrain NATO. But I think the record really tells us something different. Occasionally he says things to get people on one side riled up and the other side hopeful. But then he'll say the opposite thing like 2 weeks later. For example, he said, well, if I was in charge, I would have bombed Moscow. Right?
Right.
So anyway, yeah, I think they're going to, these NATO leaders are grappling with the fact that they're going to have Trump in charge. And I've heard anyway that they've actually kind of made secret
provisions and
okay, there's that, but that also actually that they're contacting him. They're establishing lines of communication. After screaming that anybody but Trump, they realize, oh, we're going to have Trump, so we'll have to get used to it, and probably he won't change anything. I hope he might, but he will not.
Well, it's reassuring that he's talking to people like Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban seems to be a big fan of Trump. Trump seems to like Viktor Orban, and Orban, he was at the summit meeting because he had to be, because Hungary's part of NATO, but he immediately flew to Mar-a-Lago to have a meeting with Trump because he knows what's coming.
Right.
So the fact that he has some of those people in his ear is reassuring. But like we said before, just depends who he talked to last.
Yeah,
was he chatting with Lindsey Graham right before this, or was he chatting with Orban?
Yeah. Well, I think I think the last time Trump had a meeting with Orban, I believe it was in Hungary. He announced after the meeting that not another penny for Ukraine. And then, of course, just a couple of weeks later, it was $61 billion for Ukraine.
Right.
So. Yeah, it is great that he talks to Orban and some other people. In the end, it matters who's staffing, the national security apparatus.
Right.
And so, in the end, it really doesn't matter if he's got people that are committed to the old policy under him.
Right. Yeah. You're saying that NATO's afraid that Trump will destroy NATO, but NATO is destroying NATO. They're destroying themselves by choosing to die on this Ukraine hill, this Ukraine project. Ukraine
that's why
isn't part of NATO. And I think people should also just realize that Ukraine didn't want to be part of NATO. In 2008, there was the announcement at a NATO summit saying that we're going to bring Ukraine into NATO.
Right.
And Ukraine said no. They had an election and they said, no, we don't want this.
Right.
And so what did we do? We decided to have a coup and said, you can't say no.
Yeah.
We tell
That's typical. Right.
Yeah.
That's not democratic,
Right. We say you want to be part of NATO, you have to be part of NATO.
Right.
So that's exactly what happened.
Right.
They made the announcement they want to be NATO. Like, no, we like our neutrality. We like being safe and having this buffer between both sides.
Right.
No, that wasn't the case. So we had the coup in 2014 and overthrew and put in a very pro-NATO, pro-American government. And so it's so crazy that we're going to destroy NATO by our insistence of trying to destroy. Ukraine's already destroyed. And NATO is going to be, if if it exists after this whole Ukraine project's over, it's going to exist in a very greatly weakened form. It's no longer going to be that almighty NATO power. You know, this
Right.
is the dominant military power in the world. It's like, no, actually, you're not. You're a mess. You know, you're a bureaucratic shambles, and you can't produce munitions. You're not a force. You're a paper tiger. And that's what they're doing through this Ukraine project. So it's really insane how they just want to self-destruct like this. You see it
Well,
a
I
lot
think
of
what happened is, they miscalculated. They underestimated Russian strength and resolve, and the stability of Russian society. They overestimated their own strengths and the support of their people, which is clearly lacking. And they provoked this war. And now that it's clear that they're losing, they're starting to panic because they realize, as you were just saying, they understand too that certainly their prestige, maybe their very existence is on the line. It was Boris Johnson himself who said that this is an existential threat to Western hegemony. We can't lose. So that's what they're thinking. Now it's just like, oh my God, we've gotten into this and we can't lose. But the thing is, they're losing. And so,
and there's just no way they can win. And this is what's so crazy to me. It's like they can't win, and they keep on, they bring Zelensky to all these NATO summit events. They keep on saying that, we've got a well-lit path for Ukraine to join NATO. And we keep on acting like Ukraine is part of NATO. And the speeches that, in this press conference that Biden gave, it gave the impression that, like, he's like, an attack on one is an attack on all. He's insinuating that, like, the attack on Russia, on Ukraine, is an attack on NATO. It's like they already assumed that Ukraine is NATO. They're acting that way. And it's just, it's insane.
Right. Well, but there is a difference, the fact that they're not officially part of NATO. I think it's fair to say that they were a de facto member of NATO. They had been, well supplied with arms, and their soldiers had been trained. In fact, like on the European continent, they were almost certainly had the most powerful army outside of Turkey, I would say. They more stronger than any of the other NATO countries, probably by far, because they're not officially part of NATO. NATO cannot invoke Article 5, and therefore they do not have a legal basis or for entering the conflict directly. Now they've done all but that. In fact, in some ways, you can say they've involved themselves directly. But they haven't made it official. They don't have large numbers of troops on the ground. They have some troops, clearly, but not large numbers that are in uniform. That has prevented it from expanding to an all-out war between Russia and NATO. But we're right there at the at the edge of the abyss there.
Right. I did learn one thing from Putin. Oh, not Putin, from Biden in his press conference. Cool. So now I do it too.
Yeah, right.
Is that Biden was? I didn't know that Article 5 was invoked after 9/11. I was too young back then. But that also just shows how, how you can manipulate Article 5.
Yeah.
A bunch of Saudi Arabians hijacked some planes and flew them into the Twin Towers, so we invade Iraq. Like, that was Article 5 invoked?
Yeah, well, it's actually used for Afghanistan.
I'm sorry, Afghanistan, it's... Well, why? Afghanistan didn't attack us, so...
Yeah.
It just didn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. No, that's very true. There's obviously a lot of manipulation, and probably, if they really wanted to become involved, they could find some justification for invoking Article 5 right now. Or there could be create some sort of false flag or anything. And that may, in fact, happen down the road. But so far, it's clear that they don't want to do it. I mean, I think we got another demonstration of that recently. That of course, there was back, well over a year ago, there was that incident in Poland, right, with the missiles, and which normally, just runs with every Russian atrocity story. Just shut that one down real quickly. But there was another incident. I'm drawing a blank. I'll blame it on the anesthesia right now.
Okay.
But no. Now I remember. Again, it has to do with Poland. It was actually, there was talk about, agreeing to shoot down Russian missiles that
Right.
were, approaching Poland, over Ukrainian airspace. And it was stated, I think it was by the Ukrainian government, that this had been agreed to and they had worked this out. But then later, a few days later, Poland walked it back, apparently under U.S. pressure. So again, at this point, it's clear that NATO does not want to invoke Article 5.
There was also the news that the UK would allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles to strike deep within Russia. And then that was also walked back, after just a couple days later. Like, no, that's not true. We're not allowing that.
Right.
So you do see some common sense restraint.
Yeah, there is some caution. And we just hope that will prevail. Mm-hmm. But no guarantees.
You were saying something, about how Ukraine had such a large, powerful army within NATO. You said, except maybe Turkey had a more powerful one. I've heard that also from, I think, Colonel Douglas McGregor and a few other people. So does Turkey have and I was kind of surprised, Turkey has a real strong force. Erdogan has a real strong military force. Is it larger than Germany's?
Again, yeah, that's what I understand. They actually have, many more men under arms. These Western countries have really just minuscule forces. Very few men under arms. I think like in France, they say they're talking about Macron was talking about sending 20,000 French troops. He could do that, but he couldn't do much more. I think, and what the UK has 45,000. Germany, I think, is in the same league. We're talking about tens of thousands. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands. But Turkey at least has hundreds of thousands. I don't know what the exact number is. And, they are well armed with both Western and Russian weapons. Mm-hmm. They have the, I guess, the S-400s that's something that created quite a hullabaloo. The U.S. was not happy about the fact that they bought those systems from Russia, but they have them.
What is Erdogan's stance, kind of? He seems to flip-flop a lot.
Oh, so yeah. He's always, playing one side off against the other. Mm-hmm. His stance, officially, like a lot of time when there are votes taken, he will vote on the Western side. But he's obviously kept, maintained overall decent relations with Russia. Sometimes he's really angered the Russians, like when he stabbed them in the back over that Azovstal deal. If you remember, in Mariupol, there were a number of it was the Azov battalion was holed up in the Azovstal steel plant, and they completely surrounded. They ended up surrendering, and part of the deal was that certain leaders, these far-right ultranationalists, would be sent to Turkey, and they would stay there until the war ended. And then Erdogan broke that deal, and like a year later, and gave them back to Ukraine, just to curry favor with the West. So he'll do that. And then the Russians, I think everybody knows what Erdogan's all about. But all in all, he's maintained good relations or decent relations. He's maintained relations with Russia, unlike the rest of Europe. And that's quite significant. Just to give you an example of that, I are going to fly to Russia, in just a few weeks here. And we're going to fly there through Istanbul because we can't fly from any European airport.
Mm-hmm. Except for Turkey.
Yeah.
So
right. Yeah, you're right. Istanbul is in Europe, just barely.